See guys, there's a number of different designs and types of vehicle drivetrain and suspension setups out in the market today, but I don't know of any other types of setups more controversial than the independent front suspension versus a solid axle setup. Is there one that is truly better than the other? Well, my friends, let's go find out. And real quick guys, before we jump into today's video, that if you are looking to upgrade your suspension, we literally carry 21 different brands of suspension products on our website at TrailBuilt Off-Road. This way, you guys can customize your vehicles pretty much exactly the way you want to. And remember, when checking out from the cart on TrailBuilt with your new suspension products, to click on YouTube in the Who Sent You drop-down menu to help us better keep track of our efforts through videos exactly like the one we're going to go through today. First things first, the obvious answer to the question of which setup is better, independent or solid axle, is that there are no right answers. Each design has its own unique strengths, weaknesses, compromises, advantages, and disadvantages, and the better question would be, which setup is going to be better for me in my particular situation? Well, let's start with what are the differences between the two? And to better understand the differences, let's break it down into strengths and weaknesses of each setup, starting with the ride quality. Then we'll get into which one is stronger and more reliable, the performance of each, customizable advantages, and then cost, with touching on the different situations that each setup might be better for throughout the different subjects. And what I find interesting is that Toyota hasn't put a solid axle in their pickup truck since 1985. And it wasn't that long ago, 2001 to be exact, that the entire Jeep vehicle lineup, the Wrangler TJ, Cherokee XJ, and Grand Cherokee WJ, sported a solid front axle. Now, 20 years later, only the Jeep Wrangler and Gladiator have a solid front axle. All new Ford Broncos have IFS, and the independent front suspension is also found under all new half-ton and compact pickup trucks, all SUVs, excluding the Wrangler of course, and 1/3 of 3/4 ton pickup trucks and 1-ton pickup trucks sold in the US all have the independent front suspension. And to go even a step further, all UTVs or side-by-sides come from the factory with IFS setup, and a majority have independent suspension both front and rear. Further, IFS is used on some desert racing trophy trucks as well as tough trucks, King of the Hammers race vehicles, and military vehicles. So with a vast and ever-increasing number of vehicles running IFS, we can all see there is a rising trend of popularity towards the IFS over the solid axle. But the question is, why? Originally first introduced in 1960 from Mercedes-Benz, the independent suspension is any vehicle's suspension system that allows each wheel on the same axle to move vertically independently of the others so that the tires are not linked together. By creating separate pivot points independent from the other wheels, allows for increased dynamic tuning of the performance for how each tire handles the terrain below. Whereas a solid axle, having less pivot points, connects the wheel directly across from it together, which decreases the amount of dynamic tunability. So basically, with an independent suspension system, all of the energy created by the tire hitting the bumps in the road or on the trail on one corner of the vehicle, independent from the other corners, is absorbed, dampened, and cushioned by a fine-tuned coil spring and shock absorber before the energy gets to the frame of the vehicle. This means each individual tire is being controlled separately from the others, eliminating any energy that may have been transferred from one tire to the other through like a solid axle point. An IFS setup most noticeably will almost completely get rid of the hard side-to-side jarring that you get with a solid axle setup. And with a solid axle, being that it conjoins the front tires together, whatever energy is created by the road or trail, even if it's only on one side of the vehicle or by one tire, that energy will get sent in two directions instead of just one like the independent setup. The energy gets sent up into the coil or leaf spring and shock absorber, and it also gets sent to the other side of the axle where some of the suspension absorbs it and some of the tire absorbs it, but that energy will be felt throughout both sides of the vehicle instead of throughout just one corner of the vehicle. Now, it's true that with independent suspension, you'll still get some residual energy transfer throughout the vehicle, but it'll be far more contained than the energy transferred throughout from a solid axle setup. So you can imagine when you're driving your vehicle at higher speeds, especially on bumpy roads and trails, how much energy is getting transferred into your suspension and then up into your vehicle. Now imagine each corner of your vehicle being able to handle that energy independently from each other and ultimately having much more control over that energy compared to the solid axle setup, where all of that energy is being transferred up through the entirety of the front axle and into the front of the vehicle. So then you can see just how much of a difference with cushioning the bumps and jolts from the terrain the two different types of suspension setups make. Another difference is the loading and unloading from the weight of the vehicle through the suspension. I think that most would agree if you're planning on mostly higher speed travels, dirt or paved roads, plus prefer a smoother ride, that the independent suspension is the main choice there. But what if your vehicle is built primarily for crawl speeds to conquer the more technical and controlled obstacles like, well, massive boulders and rock ledges? Then I would imagine the solid axle would be the choice there, and here's why. If you're not as concerned with how the energy is transferred up and into your vehicle and are more concerned with traction at slower speeds and keeping the rubber from the tires planted on the ground, then the solid axle is an easy choice. And this is where I'm referring to the loading and unloading from the weight of your vehicle through the suspension to the tires. Picture this. You have a solid axle rig. You're in 4 low and there's a rather large boulder field in front of you, and the only way to get to your destination is to drive through it. So you start by picking out your line and come up to the first big rock with your driver's side tire to be the first tire to drive up it. There's nothing in front of the passenger side tire at this point, just the driver's front tire. As your tire begins its ascent to cruising altitudes, the passenger side tire is going to remain on the runway, and as the driver's tire continues up the huge boulder, it's going to be putting a lot more weight from the tire and axle into the spring and shock absorber in the form of pressure, because it's also going to be pushing against the weight of the vehicle on the driver's side of the front suspension. It's commonly referred to as loading up the suspension. Meanwhile, as the axle begins to angle up or articulate upwards on the driver's side and the front of your vehicle is starting to be pushed upwards from that pressure, the passenger side tire continues to stay planted on the ground with the passenger side suspension starting to unload, meaning that the pressure on the passenger side front suspension is decreasing because of the weight being transferred to the suspension on the driver's side from the weight of the front of the vehicle. Think of it like a seesaw. You know those playground things that have a seat on each end of a big long board with some sort of fulcrum or pivot point in the middle? Well, when one end goes down, the other end goes up. When the driver's side tire is going up the rock while the passenger side tire is basically getting forced to stay on the ground, and by doing that, you'll have both front tires contacting the ground, and if one of the tires isn't touching the ground, then, well, what are we missing? That's right. We're missing the traction that we could have had if the tire was to stay contacting the ground. So with a solid front axle, when we load up the weight and pressure on one side of the axle as the tire travels upwards, it's also going to force the opposite side of the axle downwards towards the ground, keeping your tires planted firmly and keeping that much needed traction to the tires. So it loads up the suspension on one side, unloads the suspension on the other side. Because an independent suspension is just that, and independent from each other, the driver's side front tire is going to do its own thing separate from the passenger side tire in a similar circumstance. When the driver's tire starts climbing the rock and pushing the front of your vehicle upwards or loading up that side of the suspension, the passenger side suspension will max out or fully droop out to the point where the passenger side tire is going to start lifting off the ground. And guess what? When the tire is no longer contacting the ground, what are we going to be missing? Exactly, the traction needed to help your vehicle climb over those obstacles. Plus guys, when you're off camber and the vehicle is tilting one way or the other, it creates an unsafe and unstable situation. And the last thing you want at that point is for your tires to be dangling off the ground. For one, you lose that instant traction for if you have to punch the throttle, and two, the higher the weight is off of the ground for any particular part of your vehicle, the higher the center of gravity is and the more likely you are to roll your vehicle over. I haven't necessarily fact-checked this, but from my experience and observations through all the years of wheeling I've done, I would be very confident in saying that an independently equipped suspension UTV or side-by-side, whatever you guys call them, are much more likely to roll over and are much more dangerous on the trails than a solid axle vehicle is. Even at this year's Easter Jeep Safari in Moab, the only vehicle we witnessed personally roll over was a side-by-side. And there's been numerous other occasions as well. But is it driving air, or is the independent design of the suspension of a side-by-side inadequate for low-speed crawling? I definitely would be curious as to what you guys think about that, so make sure and let us know in the comments below. All right, so we've covered the two different types of suspension and how they work differently from each other. We've covered how it affects the ride comfort and handling characteristics of each other. So given what we know so far, we probably already have a pretty good understanding of which setup is better for our own personal needs related to what we use our vehicles for. But there are a few more points to cover before we can really make the ultimate determination on which one is better for us. One thing is for sure in almost every situation, and that is the more moving parts there are to something, the more costly it gets to repair or replace. With a solid axle setup, it's a pretty simple design without an overabundance of pieces and parts. Starting from the middle, you have your center section that houses the ring and pinion, the locker if you have one, some bearings, and it's filled with gear lube. That's then connected to the axle shafts, housed inside the axle tubes, of which have the inner C's affixed to them and are attached to the outer C's via some ball joints, and connected to your outer C's are the knuckles, spindles, wheel bearings, outer axle shafts, U-joints, lockouts or drive flanges, and ultimately the wheel and tire package. The axle is then held in place by some sort of link system and held up by a variety of different spring, shocks, etc., depending on what you have or decide to go with. Simple, right? And I realize it's a little bit more complex than that, but not by much. An independent suspension, on the other hand, is comprised of a series of control arms with some that have torsion bars, multi-piece axle shafts with CV shafts that are more susceptible to braking from greater angles, a fixed center section that houses the ring and pinion and are often made from a weaker but lighter cast aluminum, and steering links that are also weakened from greater angles due to suspension flex or lifting an IFS suspension. And lifting an IFS setup also entails lowering the cross member that houses the center section in order to maintain proper steering and CV angles, but also drastically reduces ground clearance as well. So all in all, to properly enhance the off-road performance of an independent front suspension, especially to get all the angles right without sacrificing ground clearance, you're looking at one hefty bill. Of which, if you planned on taking the money you would have spent on properly lifting your independent suspension, there's a good chance you could have replaced the entire IFS with a good condition salvage yard sourced solid axle and swapped that in with a brand new suspension for probably around the same price and not even that much more work at all with all the different moving parts that you'd have to replace and upgrade on an IFS system. Yes, ride quality is ultimately better with IFS, but the solid axle setup is easier to work on and upgrade, plus less costly to replace parts or to properly lift. And solid axle setups, because a straight axle system is just naturally stronger than IFS, can also handle higher load carrying capacities. It's exactly the reason as to why both Ram and Ford have continued to put straight axles in the front of their 3/4 ton trucks and higher compared to GM or Chevy. GM or Chevy, they chose ride quality and plushness over strength and durability. So for anyone looking for a 3/4 ton truck or heavier, the rule of thumb is, you want a nice ride, you go purchase a GM product. But if you want a truck that still has a purpose in life, then get yourself a Ford or a Ram. I can just hear all the GM and Chevy fans already blowing up those comments. I know I'm starting to sound a bit biased here, but really just trying to get the facts out there. Although personally, I will say this, for me, I do like the way a lifted solid axle vehicle looks much better than the lifted IFS vehicles, but that's just my opinion. So with all of the different comparisons we went through with you guys today on independent front axles versus the solid axles, definitely make sure and let us know what your preference is or which setup you think is better, and make sure to let us know why. Or even if you guys have anything else to add about the differences between the two setups, definitely make sure and let us know. Also, don't forget to check out all of the different available suspension upgrades on our website at TrailBuilt Offroad. And if you guys enjoyed today's video, make sure and hit that thumbs up and that subscribe button. And guys, as always, we appreciate all of you for watching and all of your support. I'm Josh from TrailBuilt, and we'll see you guys out on the trails.